Welcome back to PICT Voices, our podcast series featuring interviews with notable members of the broader PICT community. Today, we will be talking about eating out. As we're all aware by now, culinary establishments like restaurants, bars, and cafes are among the hardest hit businesses in our pandemic days. But there is much more at stake when eating out than just the fate of an industry. Eating out is about our cultural identity. It is about our patterns of socialization. And it is about vital elements of culture, such as the very concept of hospitality. Where, how, and with whom we eat out are choices at once personal and intimate, while at the same time producing a butterfly effect that ripples across our entire culture and even the world at large. My name is David Selim Sayers, and my guest today is culinary critic, writer, and broadcaster William Sitwell, whose latest book, The Restaurant, A History of Eating Out, takes readers on a culinary journey all the way from ancient Rome to Instagram. William, thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited and happy to talk to you.
Thank you, William. So without further ado, let me just lead straight into my first question to you. And that question concerns the connection between eating out and socializing, because throughout your book, you insist that eating out is as much about socialization as it is about the food itself. This socialization can take many different forms, for example, political gatherings, and many states throughout history have in fact attempted to ban certain culinary establishments to suppress opposition. The socialization can also transcend social boundaries, such as in pubs where you describe commoners and the highborn rubbing shoulders, and it can manifest such boundaries. For instance, in contemporary high-end restaurants with prohibitive prices and exclusive clienteles. The socialization can even happen via social media, with influencers patronizing restaurants primarily to share photos of the dishes. And with the new phenomenon of social distancing, the very link between cuisine and socialization seems to be in jeopardy. So, William, in your opinion, is socialization an essential aspect of cuisine, or can we imagine a lively and creative cuisine without the component of socialization?
Well, there's a lot of things to get our head around there. It's a very excellent question, covering quite a lot of ground. I think what's interesting, one of the key things I'd say is that if you asked someone, why do you eat out? Most people would probably, the knee-jerk reaction would be, well, because I'm hungry. And traditionally, that's what hospitality has existed to serve. Hospitality, which was enshrined more or less in law and had a god that oversaw it in the sort of ancient world in the Roman Empire, ancient Greece, was something that was expected that travelers would get for free. Hospitality was stretched across the Roman Empire as an administrative thing, in the same way that its taxes, language, and laws stretched. And a traveler across an empire, and it was pretty similar within the Ottoman Empire, could again expect hospitality to be given. And that hospitality was sating a very basic need, which was the need for food, the need for sustenance in order to be able to survive. But over time, what we see, of course, is that the phenomenon of eating out that stems from what I call eating away, in other words, people having to travel for whatever reason, probably for work, have to eat away from their village, their home, by necessity. Once that eating away becomes established and a building is built in order to serve it, it becomes eating out. And as eating out solidifies itself within the world's various cultures, and as it becomes more sophisticated, you, at the other end of the spectrum of need, where eating out begins, you get not even greed, you get people eating out because they want to be seen. So when eating out becomes part of a sort of expression of yourself in terms of fashion, and you talk about my history going from ancient history to Instagram. Instagram is a the selfie culture about look at me, look at where I am, look at what I'm doing, look at what I'm eating out says about me. It's not about sating hunger. So you get to this extraordinary position where businesses are built attracting people to go and eat in places where it's not about the food necessarily. And then also you've got, I think, the very real approach that the food critic Adrian Gill, the late great Adrian Gill of the Sunday Times, talked about, which was that if the food was the only thing that you'd be interested in when you're eating out, then you're going to the wrong places or you're with the wrong people. So it's a very, very complicated subject to grapple with, because while we have a need to eat, we also have a need to be joined in that spirit of hospitality with friends, and so food then becomes a part of that socialization. If you go out and you've had a great time, but all you talk about is the food, I suggest you probably haven't had such a great time. Which is why the greatest chefs, the greatest restaurateurs of all time are not just feeders. They have a philosophy. They are interior designers, they're businessmen, they're managers. And as I say in the book, it helps if they can cook. Yeah. So once you start to look at it like that, you realize that eating out is a very, very complicated institution. And when you're then stopped from doing it, as we have been recently, it's not just about the dangers to a huge swathe of jobs, as we're seeing right now in the UK, some 3 million people jeopardized, some 3 million jobs jeopardized because of a government's insistence at the moment, as we speak, to adhere to a 2-meter rule of social distancing. So eating out then becomes a cornerstone, not just of culture, but of economy, where 9 million people's jobs in the entirety in the United Kingdom, for example, are employed in that business. So eating out goes from this small, humble desire to be fed to a cornerstone of culture, a key part of the economy, and a key badge of our own character and the way that we wish people to see us.
Yeah, I mean, William, here you've really touched upon a range of subjects, very, very interesting subjects that I would like to explore with you in a little bit more depth. And maybe the first place for me to start that exploration would be with the question of economy that you touched upon. Because, I mean, when we talk about the sort of gastronomical economy or the cuisine economy, we're not just obviously talking about the economy of a country, but we're actually talking about a globalized industry. We're talking about a globalized economy. And what you said about eating out becoming such a cornerstone of culture and such a cornerstone of the economy contrasts with your description, for example, of post-war Britain, where you describe in your book how food was rationed, ingredients were local, eating out was in fact frowned upon, as was travel, and immigration was at a low point. And when you describe the results of that, like the resulting cuisine in such a situation, you give the impression of a bland, somewhat unimaginative and provincialized cuisine, mostly deprived, in fact, of global influences and ingredients. But, I mean, the picture is not so simple, right? Because on the other hand, it seems to me that the food that was available during those years was in fact nutritionally balanced, locally and seasonally sourced, and ethically and environmentally sustainable. So today, as you described, the coronavirus lockdown bringing the culinary industry to a standstill and putting all those jobs in jeopardy, it seems to me we've come full circle in a way to face the same dilemma as was maybe faced in those post-war years. In that, do we want to return to the local? I mean, this could be a possibility to restart a restaurant industry based on a return to the local, but maybe at the cost of diversity and variety. Or do we want, in fact, to insist on a return to the pre-coronavirus situation, the global and industrial, with its connotations, with its sometimes negative connotations of human and environmental exploitation? Or do you think that maybe in the aftermath of the coronavirus, there will be some unexpected way to have our cake, as it were, and eat it too? And that can we find a way to move towards a cuisine and move towards an industry that is at the same time responsible, but also, firstly, open to global influences, and secondly, economically interesting?
Well, the first thing I'd say that in those bleak post-war years, the Britain was, I suppose, in order to be able to, by dint of the need to survive, was insular and inward-looking, because it was very important during the war and in the years that immediately preceded it that rationing was maintained, because the supply chains were going to take some time to get up and running. So the kind of cultural acceptance of rationing was a very important thing, because if people were unhappy with the situation they faced, then you would have seen people revolting against it and rebelling against it. So the insular situation that we saw in those fairly difficult years after the war, I think, helped to create a stabilized society. But of course, then what you have over the coming years is you see the growth of globalization, fueled by the ability to travel, as travel is democratized, and as supply chains and technology enables people to communicate very quickly across the world, which means that you get to a position that we were at the beginning of this year, where decades of immigration and of travel mean that culturally we are exposed to all the upsides of globalization, which is we have our palate broadened and we're able to eat food from all across the world. So you could say that the cat is out of the bag in terms of our exposure to all these foreign influences and the joys that come with that. So if, as you say, we then find ourselves back full circle to a situation where we're focused on the local, by, again, necessity, because actually supply chains haven't been affected, but there has been a feeling of thinking about local cuisine, people not going to their supermarkets as much, even now, because there are queues, using box schemes, organic vegetables, using your farmers markets. But actually, whilst in some ways we may have come circle in terms of the focus on the local, because of our exposure to the global, there are still the most extraordinary array of ingredients. So whatever we're cooking now, it is a lot more exciting than it was in the 1950s. So we've already exposed our palates to that level of excitement. So I don't think there'll be any going back. The negative consequences, of course, of COVID are this inability to rub shoulder to shoulder, to meet strangers, to meet friends, to enable great chefs who are fantastic arbiters of the cuisines that they represent, either because they're immigrants or because they've taught themselves how to cook those foods because they love them, they've traveled to those places. And I think it's a big shame if a lot of these restaurants cannot operate because of COVID restrictions. It does mean, I think, that culturally, I think that is a shame, because our focus becomes more narrow. If we're cooking more at home, it's about our own abilities to cook rather than being able to enjoy the fruits of other people's labors.
Yes. But I think in terms of, what you were saying in terms of the supply chains not being really significantly interrupted, and also the ability to rub shoulders. When you were saying that, I was thinking over here in Paris, now that the lockdown is lifted, and cafes and restaurants have been given the limited freedom to welcome guests again, at least on the sidewalks where they're allowed to put their tables. And now when I walk past those cafes and restaurants that are now mostly on the streets, people are on the streets, but people are decidedly and very aggressively rubbing shoulders, as it were. So
Oh, are they? That's
yes,
interesting.
yes,
So
they are. Yeah,
you're
yeah.
seeing a rebellion on a small level.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's something that is sort of very like the cafe culture, the sort of communal culture of dining out and eating out and having a coffee in the afternoon. That is something so ingrained in the Parisian culture that I think it's difficult for people to imagine this city without these kinds of socializations that are occasioned by coming together for food or for a simple, just to have a sip of something to drink. But so you don't really anticipate any kind of major reshuffle in the way that globally food is supplied and sourced.
Well, I don't, because these supply lines and these businesses exist. Of course, where they will be affected is if the need for imports diminishes. So, if because of government restrictions, huge swathes of the restaurant business go out of business, go bust, and therefore there isn't a need for specific ingredients, then those ingredients won't come in, and then they won't then be widely available because the source of those ingredients themselves might find themselves going out of business.
Absolutely.
Um, so only time will tell. It depends on what the various governments do, and it depends on whether people adhere to those restrictions. And actually, if people vote by their feet, and I know this isn't particularly specifically relevant to our conversation, but while we're talking about it, if thousands can gather and protest for whatever reason, it's very hard to try and insist that you can't go to the pub in a group of six of you. So I think that I don't think that the European nations will tolerate being told that they can't express themselves
Yeah, and I think
in that way. So I think that I don't think that people will accept it. So as I say, globalization exists. There's many good things about it. So I don't see that ultimately as being affected. And as I say, supermarkets are very sophisticated. The logistical chains are in very good health. Shops have not run out of food. So I don't see that as being a long-term trend,
yes,
in terms of globalization being diminished.
yes, I mean, I agree with you, and in fact, as concerns people voting with their feet, I think you're absolutely right. We're seeing very well right now that, as a matter of fact, if you want to, I mean, governments can hardly impose something if there is not enough consensus from the bottom to sort of support that decision and to go along with that decision from the top. That has become abundantly clear in the days and weeks that we've just experienced. Regarding, I mean, what you were saying earlier about all the different foreign ingredients, all the different sort of cultural influences coming to bear upon the cuisine that is at our disposal. I wanted to dig a little bit further into that because when we look at the place of cuisine within culture, also when I look at it as a scholar of culture, I see that cuisine is on the one hand, cuisine is one of the most porous aspects of culture because it exudes and absorbs influences to and from around the world. But at the same time, cuisine is one of the most tenacious aspects of culture, and it can survive even when its originating communities cease to exist. One example is the Ottoman Empire, to which you also devote a chapter in your book. There's a very interesting film, a 2003 film, filmed in Greece, called Politiki Cousina, by Tassos Boumetis, and translated into English as A Touch of Spice. And here, Ottoman cuisine and the cultural dimension of Ottoman cuisine is highlighted in that, on the one hand, Ottoman cuisine is presented as a thoroughly hybrid cuisine, thriving on contributions from the empire's various ethno-religious communities. But on the other hand, in the 19th century, these communities were torn apart by war, genocide, and the emerging ideology of nationalism, but the cuisine survived, going on to become perhaps the most influential aspect of Ottoman culture that is still alive today. So on the one hand, cuisine seems to be kind of a focal point of national and maybe via national, even personal identity, right? But on the other hand, cuisine is incredibly porous and permeable, and intercultural influences abound. So could you speak a little bit to this tension in cuisine between representing cultural identity and transcending it?
Yes, I mean, I have to say this is one of my favorite sort of subjects that unintentionally seem to crop up from my book. It is so interesting because, as you say, it is this wonderful idea of cuisine and the culture of cuisine being porous, and that porous aspect of it abuts all, all the issues that surround immigration. And I think actually that Great Britain is an acute example of this. It's probably the best example in the world of this, because if you go to any British provincial town today, COVID-19 aside, you see on either side of the high street cuisines represented from around the world, from Nepal to Bangladesh, to from Japan to Beijing, from Paris to Milan to Madrid, and beyond. And if you were to judge a country like Britain, okay, on its cuisine, you would have to say, given the fact that there's such an array of different food from around the world, you must embrace immigrant culture like no other country. But yet we know that there is also, and has been historically, a section of society of Britain that has that's more that displays anti-immigrant feelings. And some people say that the Brexit argument sort of exacerbates and shows that. So I think that's a very interesting thing. And I write in the book that, there are nations around the world that feel negative about the immigrants, but then they suddenly seem to forget that negativity when they lap up the wonderful food that they bring. So then linked with that, you've also got this very thorny subject of cultural appropriation, where people representing cuisines of different nations and different cultures represent those cuisines and steal them, some may say, and then appropriate them and then misappropriate them and tweak them to change and to change them to suit the palates of the country. And we see this in America with sort of Mexican cuisine, the bastardization of tacos. Mm-hmm. But then you see, in fact, even in there are examples in the United States of Mexican immigrants themselves doing it, Italian immigrants themselves doing it, bastardizing their own cuisines to satisfy the more simpler palates of their fellow countrymen in those countries in which they have settled. Yes. So sometimes the bastardization of food can be blamed on the immigrants who knew about them but changed them in order to make money. So it's a very complicated scenario. But I suppose through what the overriding things that comes out of this is the battles to produce food and create food. There's one happy ending, and that is the consumer who suddenly has all this choice. But then there's also always the opportunity for second or third generation immigrant or someone from a different culture to see foods and say, well, look, actually, I don't like that. I want to explore the authenticity and to actually create food that I think more represents that original culture. And you see it, for example, Atul Kochhar, great Indian chef, now in his new restaurant in Mayfair in London, Kanishka, celebrating the acute regional differences in food in Indian cuisine, which again is a great contrast to the sort of amorphous Bangladeshi offering that Indian restaurants came to do in the 1970s, 80s and beyond. So every time that a cuisine is changed for whatever reason, it always gives someone else the opportunity to do the opposite, right, to delve deeper and create something more authentic. So it's a constantly revolving situation where there's always new energy and people are always trying to say, well, I want to do something better. I want to rebel against that. I want to reclaim my heritage. I want to demonstrate an authentic version of that heritage. And cuisine enables you to do this. You can do all of this, and it's not just a talking shop, because it's also an eating shop. So you have these conversations, these arguments, but at the end of the day, yippee, there's some decent grub for us to eat. And so people who have absolutely no interest in the subject end up still being the winners, and they play their part in it because they can eat the results of this cultural debate.
Absolutely. And I mean, like, in a sense, the reason that people can do this, the reason that people can pull cuisine in all of these different directions, and the reason that, you can still, the fact that people who might be against something like immigration would still be able to go out and enjoy the food produced by cultural exchange, is the fact that,
Exactly. So,
yeah,
because you can, let me just say, because, yeah,
sure.
yeah, if you're a racist, okay, if you don't like, you know, Indians for some reason, if you're racist, that doesn't stop you going and eating their food,
Absolutely.
So you can
Absolutely.
hate their culture, but but you're allowed to eat
Yeah.
the food of their culture, the greatest manifestation of that culture.
Right.
Shows how tolerant we are.
Right. So food, in a way, manages to transgress boundaries that other forms of cultural expression that might be national or regional in origin don't actually manage
Yes.
in transcending. In that sense, food is innocuous but also subversive in the way that it brings together
Yeah.
these different cultures and exposes them to each other. I think that's very well argued on your part, and this has something to do with the fact that food, cuisine, ultimately, no matter how many sort of Michelin-starred restaurants or sort of original celebrated star chefs we might have, remains a communal affair, remains in a sense a folkloric affair where it can be passed on, it can be reproduced, it can be meddled with, and it can be manipulated by anybody who chooses to tune in to the cultural discourse surrounding a specific kind of cuisine. And this cultural discourse kind of brings me back full circle to what you were saying at the very beginning of our interview, where you mentioned the concept of hospitality. And I want to come back to that in closing off the interview, because that is a very, very interesting concept for me. You do discuss, I mean, you already mentioned how hospitality in the Roman Empire had a legal and sacred nature or position, standing. You also recount how the 14th century world traveler, Ibn Battuta, probably rarely had to pay for a meal during his travels of 32 years. Well, indeed, as I was just saying, for most of world history, cuisine was a folkloric, communal, and freely shared cultural practice. But in your book, you also describe how, especially from the 19th century onwards, cuisine has entered a process of professionalization and commodification, with a chef rebranded as an individual creative genius, and food itself becoming another product to be sold. So do you think that cuisine is in some way decoupling itself from values such as community and hospitality? And asked in the opposite direction, do you think that such values as hospitality, which sound very, very nice in an abstract sense, do you think they can even be sustained in a society without actual manifestations, factual, tangible manifestations such as freely shared food?
Well, I certainly think it's true that it's much harder today to travel the world without having to pay for food. Um, Relatively recently, there was a great writer called Paddy Lee Fermor, and he traveled right across Europe, Eastern Europe, and he was fed because he entertained on his way. He stayed with people. He sang for his supper, literally, as so many people have done over the centuries. His conversation, his ability to pick up languages, his ability to connect and talk and entertain meant that he was fed for free wherever he traveled, and this was commonplace historically, as you touched upon. Historically, Ibn Battuta, the great Muslim scholar, traveled through the Ottoman Empire, and like so many others, could travel and stay normally in religious institutions where you weren't a you didn't have to beg for food if you were a traveler, people would give you shelter and give you food, and they might give you cakes and sweets to go on your journey and wish you well. But as cuisine has become more sophisticated, and as you say, as it's become this product, as chefs have become this sort of celebrated entity, so hospitality has gone from being something that is freely given, gratefully accepted, to something that is commercialized. So the very meaning of hospitality becomes obscured, divorced from its original meaning, which is giving of free. You know, when someone's hospitable in the home, that's absolutely it. You look after them and you feed them, the most important thing. Hospitality now, when we talk about it, is an industry. It's an enormous business. So has the whole concept of hospitality and in its original meaning been destroyed by this concept of food becoming such a globalized phenomenon and a business, and something that so many people go into? And I think the answer probably has to be yes, because I don't think it's, you know, if you turn up as a stranger and knock on someone's door, they call the police. They don't welcome you in and feed you. We are taught now to be, afraid and wary of strangers, not to welcome strangers in. You know, we have electric gates, we have locks on our doors. We are very worried if people we don't know turn up. In COVID, even if our grandmother turns up, we can't let her in. So, you know, that has exacerbated the idea of, hospitality. It now kills you because you can't rub shoulders with people. So the latest crisis has killed the concept even further, in that welcoming a stranger, A, is dangerous, and B, it could kill you. So we are in an extraordinary place today, and the giving and receiving of free gifts and drinks and food is now a
Yes.
I have no idea. I hope so, because it all comes down to eventually the goodwill of the human spirit, and we live by necessity and creativity.
Right. Well, I mean, that is.
So let's learn from this and become givers. Sorry.
I think that is a very, very important message to give, in fact, or to a kind of a reminder to put in front of people. I mean, I just remember yesterday our institute is in a partnership with an Anglophone bookstore here in Paris, the Red Wheelbarrow, and I was going there to visit the bookstore, and I had just cooked something at home, like a basic Turkish dish at home, and I decided to take some of it with me so that the people at the bookstore could eat it and just take a little break and eat it. And just the joy of actually seeing those people come together and commune, and everybody take a little bit of that food, and just the, as the cook, as the person who was preparing that food, to see the sort of community and the joy that was engendered by the free offering, of course, and by the sharing of that food is a feeling that I can only recommend to people. That is definitely something that people should try out. Hospitality is not just something that is nice for the recipient, but hospitality is actually something that can be very, very edifying for the person who provides it as well.
Yes, exactly. And unfortunately, bureaucracy means that when people try and hand out pots of jam, that if it's not, been industrially made, that, you should deny it, because that might kill you. So bureaucracy and disease, and greed and commerciality have all sort of come together in a perfect storm. But as you say, the old saying is, it is better to give than to receive. And I think that people should think about that. But I would say that, on the contrary to all of this, so many restaurants, particularly in the UK, the chefs have been giving. They've been cooking for key workers in our National Health Service, and they've not been doing this for money. So there's been a lot of goodwill. There's been a lot of community spirit that's also come out of COVID, and much of that has been about providing food and caring. So bearing that in mind, there is a bit of hope.
Yes, and I think we can count on the fact that the preparation of food and the communal consumption of food is not going to go anywhere. These are going to stay as central tenets of human culture and human societies. So in one way or another, I have no doubt that we'll always find our way back to the idea of communal sharing of food with those close to us and with those who are in need. So William, thank you very, very much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you so much. And if anyone feels like further exploration, my book, The Restaurant, A History of Eating Out, is available through all good bookshops. But I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I really enjoyed examining some of these cultural influences that have emerged, some of them unexpectedly in my journey as I've written about this story. So thank you so much for your interest, and this is a discussion that we could keep going on. So thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
It's absolutely a discussion that we could keep having, and once circumstances permit, and if and when you travel to Paris, I hope that you will also be with us, and we will get to meet you face to face, and hopefully maybe also do perhaps a book talk or a guest lecture for the Paris Institute over here.
Anything to try your Turkish treats.
Oh, yes, absolutely. That will absolutely be a part of it. So that brings us to the end of another PICT Voices. Our live events, courses, and workshops will start up again as soon as health conditions permit. And you've heard, in return for a taste of my Turkish cuisine, William Sitwell might be persuaded to talk for us as well in person. So we can't wait to get to see all of you, all members of the PICT community in person again. In the meantime, thank you all for tuning in, and we hope to challenge you with another PICT podcast very soon.